Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Harlan, Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. Harlan County, Kentucky, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, has long been known for its coal mining history, labor disputes, and the tight-knit communities that formed in its isolated hollows. But in the winter of 1950, something happened at the old Whitaker property on Ivy Mountain that has never been fully explained. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not just what happened, but how the sisters who witnessed it never could agree on what they saw. The Whitaker family homestead sat on 43 acres of wooded land, approximately 7 miles northeast of the Harlan courthouse. The property had been in the family since before the Civil War, passed down through generations. By 1950, only the 3 Whitaker sisters remained: Eleanor, age 42, the eldest and most practical; Margaret, 39, who had returned from Louisville following a divorce; and Virginia, 36, who had never married and rarely left the property. The house itself was a testament to another era, a 2-story Victorian structure with a wraparound porch built in 1878 by the sisters' grandfather, Jeremiah Whitaker, a successful timber merchant. According to county records, the original construction included several architectural peculiarities common to houses of that period, but unusual for the region, including a narrow service corridor that ran between certain walls. This feature would later become central to the mystery surrounding the property. The Whitakers had once been among the most prominent families in Harlan County. Jeremiah had employed dozens of men in his timber operation before the coal companies arrived. The sisters' father, William Whitaker, had maintained the family's standing through shrewd investments and by leasing portions of their land to early mining operations. But by 1950, the family's influence had waned considerably. The 3 sisters lived in relative isolation, their connections to the community having attenuated with each passing year. According to Mabel Collins, who operated the general store in nearby Evarts, the sisters were different from each other as could be, but still bound together by something you couldn't quite name. Eleanor, tall and austere with prematurely gray hair, managed the household finances from the small income generated by leasing portions of their land to a timber company. She was known for her practicality and business acumen, often handling matters that would typically fall to male family members in that era. Margaret, who had spent nearly a decade in Louisville before returning to Harlan County in 1948, brought with her an air of urban sophistication that set her apart from most local women. Her divorce was rarely mentioned but widely known, a scandal that had gradually faded into acceptance. She had secured a position as a secretary at the county clerk's office, where her elegant handwriting and precise attention to detail made her valuable despite the whispers that sometimes followed her. Virginia, the youngest, was described by those who knew her as ethereal and distant. With delicate features and a tendency to speak softly, she seemed to exist partially in another world. She tended to the property and kept a modest garden that supplied much of their food, often spending entire days without speaking to anyone, including her sisters. Local doctor Samuel Wilson, who occasionally treated the family, noted in his records that Virginia displayed characteristics consistent with nervous fragility, though no formal diagnosis was ever recorded. Neighbors described the sisters collectively as pleasant but private, rarely participating in community gatherings except for the occasional church service at the Cumberland Baptist Church. Their isolation was not viewed as particularly unusual in a region where geographical barriers often created naturally secluded communities and where family units tended to be self-sufficient. The events that would irrevocably alter the lives of the Whitaker sisters and become one of Harlan County's most enduring mysteries began to unfold in the autumn of 1950. According to testimonies gathered later, subtle changes in the dynamics at the Whitaker home were noticed by the few people who regularly interacted with the sisters. Abigail Hayes, an elderly neighbor who lived approximately half a mile down the mountain, recalled that beginning in September of that year, Eleanor Whitaker appeared increasingly tense during her weekly visits to deliver eggs. She jumped at small noises, Hayes stated in a 1963 interview, and more than once I caught her staring off toward the house with a look I'd never seen on her face before, like she was trying to puzzle something out. Margaret's supervisor at the county clerk's office, Harold Jenkins, noted in a statement that she began arriving late to work in October and November, something entirely out of character for her. On several occasions he observed her with a distracted manner and the appearance of someone who hadn't slept properly. When questioned about her well-being, Margaret reportedly attributed her condition to household concerns, but offered no specific explanation. Virginia's behavior showed the least obvious change, perhaps because her naturally withdrawn personality made subtle alterations less apparent to outsiders. However, Reverend Thomas Parker of Cumberland Baptist Church made note in his personal journal, later submitted to investigators, that Virginia had approached him after a service in early November, asking cryptic questions about unwanted visitors and whether the church might offer sanctuary to those in need. Parker described the conversation as disjointed and concerning, but when he attempted to gain clarification, Virginia became flustered and left abruptly. What happened on the night of December 17, 1950, would fracture their relationship irrevocably and become the subject of local speculation for years to come. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow had begun to fall across Harlan County. According to weather records from that evening, visibility was poor, with fog settling in the valleys. By 9:00 p.m., most of the scattered homes on Ivy Mountain were dark, their occupants having retired early, as was common in rural communities, before the widespread adoption of television. The first official report of disturbance came from Sheriff Robert Hensley, who documented a frantic call received at approximately 11:42 p.m. from Eleanor Whitaker. The transcript, preserved in county archives and later unsealed as part of a cold case review in 1963, notes that Eleanor reported an intruder on the property and requested immediate assistance. The transcript includes Eleanor stating, "There's been an incident. A man broke in. There's blood. Please come quickly." When asked by the operator if anyone was injured, Eleanor's response was recorded as unclear, inaudible, followed by, "Just send someone." "Please hurry." Deputy James Collins was dispatched to the property but would not arrive for nearly 45 minutes due to the deteriorating road conditions. His patrol log, which was meticulously kept according to department regulations, notes that he left the sheriff's office in Harlan at 11:50 p.m. and arrived at the Whitaker property at 12:34 a.m. The delay would later be scrutinized by investigators, though ultimately deemed unavoidable given the weather and the remote location of the property. Upon arrival, Deputy Collins found the three sisters in states of severe distress, though in markedly different ways. According to his report, Eleanor appeared composed but visibly shaken, standing on the front porch with her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Margaret was described as hysterical and inconsolable, pacing the parlor and alternately crying and laughing in a manner Collins found deeply unsettling. Virginia sat motionless on the porch swing, refusing to speak or acknowledge his presence, staring fixedly at a point in the darkness beyond the yard. Most troubling, all three women had blood on their clothing, which they claimed belonged to the intruder. Collins' report details his immediate search of the property, conducted with flashlight in hand, as the house's electricity was functioning only intermittently due to the weather. He found no signs of an intruder within the house. The front door showed no damage, and all windows remained intact and locked from the inside. The back door was unlocked but showed no signs of forced entry. Inside, the house displayed what Collins described as minor signs of disturbance. A kerosene lamp lay broken in the parlor, its contents having spilled across the hardwood floor. In the kitchen, 3 water glasses were shattered on the floor near the sink, and a chair had been overturned. A cast-iron skillet sat on the kitchen table rather than in its usual place on the stove or hanging rack, a detail that would later take on significance. Yet no intruder was found that night. No footprints in the snow other than those belonging to the sisters and the deputy. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of a struggle beyond the broken lamp and glasses. The mystery might have been dismissed as hysteria or fabrication, except for one disturbing detail: a trail of blood droplets leading from the kitchen, across the back porch, and into the woods behind the property. The trail continued for approximately 30 yards before disappearing near an old well that had been capped in the 1930s. Deputy Collins radioed for additional assistance, and by 1:15 a.m., Sheriff Hensley himself had arrived at the property along with Deputy Thomas Grant. Due to the continuing snowfall, which was rapidly obscuring potential evidence, Hensley made the decision to take preliminary statements from the sisters immediately, rather than waiting for daylight to conduct a more thorough investigation of the grounds. It was during these initial interviews, conducted separately with each sister in different rooms of the house, that the first major inconsistencies in their accounts emerged. These testimonies, sealed until 1963 as part of an inconclusive investigation, reveal contradictions that have never been reconciled. Eleanor's account, delivered with remarkable precision, described a man of average height and build who knocked on their door shortly after 10:30 p.m., claiming his car had broken down on the road below. She stated that they invited him in out of the cold, offered him coffee, and were in the process of telephoning for assistance when he suddenly produced a knife and demanded money. According to Eleanor, there was a struggle during which Margaret struck the man with a cast-iron skillet. She claimed he fled bleeding through the back door, and they immediately called the sheriff. When asked to describe the intruder in greater detail, Eleanor provided a consistent but notably vague description. A white man, perhaps in his 30s or early 40s, medium build, neither tall nor short, dark hair, I believe, though he wore a hat for most of the time. He spoke with what I would call an educated accent, not local to this area. Despite further questioning, she could provide no additional distinguishing features, explaining that the poor lighting and the shock of the situation had limited her observation. Eleanor's timeline placed the intruder's arrival at 10:30 p.m., the attack at approximately 11:15 p.m., and his flight from the house immediately thereafter. When Sheriff Hensley pointed out that the call to the sheriff's office wasn't placed until 11:42 p.m., Eleanor explained the delay by stating that they had first needed to tend to Virginia, who had become unresponsive after the intruder fled. She maintained this account with unwavering consistency throughout her initial statement and in all subsequent interviews. Margaret's version, taken in the parlor while Eleanor was interviewed in the kitchen, diverged significantly. In her statement, she insisted that no one had knocked on the door that night. Instead, she claimed that Virginia had invited a man she'd been secretly meeting for several months to dinner. Margaret described him as tall, well-dressed, and speaking with an accent that wasn't from around here. She stated that during the meal, Eleanor and the man began arguing about politics, specifically about labor unions and the coal mines. According to Margaret, Eleanor had become increasingly agitated as the conversation progressed, eventually accusing the man of being a communist sympathizer. In her telling, the man became enraged at this accusation, pulled a knife from his coat, and lunged at Eleanor, at which point Margaret struck him with the skillet in defense of her sister. Margaret's statement included several specific details absent from Eleanor's account. She described the man as wearing a blue serge suit with a faint pinstripe and silver cufflinks shaped like horse heads. She claimed he had introduced himself as Robert and mentioned connections to a coal operation in Tennessee. Most significantly, she stated that following the altercation, the man had staggered out the back door, bleeding profusely from a head wound, and that Virginia had followed him outside to make sure he left the property. When asked why Virginia would follow a dangerous injured man into the darkness, Margaret reportedly became confused and changed her statement, saying that perhaps Virginia had remained inside after all. Sheriff Hensley's notes indicate that Margaret appeared increasingly disoriented as the interview progressed, at times contradicting herself or introducing entirely new elements to her narrative before withdrawing them. Virginia's account, recorded the following day after she finally began speaking again, contradicted both sisters entirely. Virginia claimed there had never been a man in the house that night. Instead, she stated that the three sisters had been arguing over the possible sale of the property. According to Virginia, Eleanor wanted to sell to a coal company that had been pressuring them for months, while she and Margaret opposed the idea. Virginia claimed that the argument became heated and Eleanor threatened to proceed with the sale regardless of their objections. In Virginia's telling, Margaret became enraged and attacked Eleanor with a kitchen knife. Virginia intervened, suffering a cut to her hand in the process, and managed to disarm Margaret. She claimed the blood belonged to both Eleanor and herself from minor wounds sustained during the altercation, and that they had concocted the intruder story to protect Margaret, who had been unwell since her divorce. Virginia's statement included a level of detail regarding the argument over the property that aligned with documented facts not publicly known. Records from the county clerk's office would later confirm that representatives from Cumberland Coal Company had indeed approached Eleanor regarding the sale of the Whitaker land, with preliminary paperwork having been filed in October 1950. This lent Virginia's account a degree of credibility despite its contradiction of her sister's statements. However, Virginia's explanation failed to account for the blood trail leading from the house to the well. When pressed on this point, she became evasive, suggesting first that an animal might have been injured and then that Eleanor might have distributed blood to create the appearance of an intruder's escape. Neither explanation satisfied investigators, but without further evidence, they could not dismiss her account entirely. Sheriff Hensley found no conclusive evidence to support any of these conflicting accounts. The knife allegedly used by the intruder or in the sisters' altercation, depending on which account one believed, was never recovered. The blood on the women's clothing was collected and analyzed at a laboratory in Lexington, but in 1950 forensic techniques were limited. The report simply confirmed it was human blood, type O, which matched none of the sisters. A search of the property conducted the following day revealed no further evidence beyond the blood trail, which ended near the sealed well. Consideration was given to opening the well, but geological assessments indicated it had collapsed internally years earlier, making it unlikely anything, or anyone, could have been disposed of there recently. The investigation stalled, with Sheriff Hensley documenting his frustration. 3 women, 3 stories, and not enough evidence to know which, if any, approaches the truth. The case remained open but inactive until 1953, when a startling development occurred. A hunter named Thomas Grayson discovered what appeared to be a shallow grave approximately half a mile from the Whitaker property, near an abandoned mining access road. The remains of a male, estimated to have died 2 to 3 years prior, were excavated. The coroner's report noted a severe fracture to the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. A rusted pocketknife was found among the remains, along with a partially decomposed leather wallet containing $27 and a driver's license belonging to a Robert Caldwell of Knoxville, Tennessee. The discovery prompted a reopening of the Whitaker case, with investigators immediately seeking to establish whether this Robert Caldwell could be the intruder described by Eleanor or the dinner guest mentioned by Margaret. The timing of Caldwell's presumed death, based on the coroner's estimates, aligned approximately with the December 1950 incident at the Whitaker property. Authorities attempted to connect Caldwell to the Whitaker incident, but again, the sisters' stories diverged dramatically. Eleanor claimed never to have heard the name before and maintained that the intruder had never introduced himself. Margaret, however, immediately identified Caldwell's name as that of Virginia's gentleman caller, though the physical description she provided differed significantly from the driver's license photograph. Virginia maintained that Caldwell was a coal company representative who had been pressuring Eleanor to sell the property and whom she had met once at the county clerk's office, but never at their home. Records from Knoxville confirmed that a Robert Caldwell, age 38, had been reported missing in January 1951 after failing to return from a business trip to eastern Kentucky. His employer, the Blue Ridge Mining Company, stated that Caldwell had been surveying potential properties for acquisition, but had no specific record of him contacting the Whitakers. Caldwell's widow, interviewed by Tennessee authorities cooperating with the Kentucky investigation, described him as dedicated to his work but not someone who would pressure reluctant sellers, adding that he wouldn't hurt a fly. The investigation intensified, and each sister was questioned extensively. Psychological evaluations were ordered by the court, the results of which were sealed until 1968. When finally made public as part of a review of unsolved cases in Harlan County, the evaluations painted a disturbing picture of family dynamics and psychological fragmentation. Dr. Howard Freeman, who conducted the evaluations at Eastern State Hospital in Lexington, noted that all three women displayed compartmentalized thinking patterns and what he termed selective reality construction. In his assessment, each sister genuinely believed her version of events to be true, despite the impossibility of reconciling their accounts. Most concerning was his observation that when confronted with evidence contradicting their statements, each sister would become not hostile or defensive, but rather confused and disoriented, as if unable to process information that challenged their established narrative. Dr. Ibtipi. Freeman's report suggested that the Whitaker sisters might represent a rare case of what he termed shared psychotic disorder with divergent manifestations, essentially a folie à trois, in which a primary delusion had fractured and evolved differently in each woman's mind. This controversial diagnosis was never formally applied in any legal context, but has been extensively discussed in subsequent psychological literature examining the case. The case took another turn in 1955 when Margaret Whitaker was admitted to Eastern State Hospital in Lexington after what was described as a nervous collapse. The precipitating incident, according to Eleanor's statement to authorities, occurred when Margaret awoke the entire household with her screams in the middle of the night, claiming there was someone in the walls watching us sleep. Eleanor attributed the episode to the long-term stress following the 1950 incident and Margaret's increasing difficulty maintaining her employment at the county clerk's office, where her work had reportedly become erratic and her behavior increasingly paranoid. During her treatment at Eastern State Hospital, Margaret reportedly made statements to her psychiatrist, Dr. Elizabeth Colton, that cast further doubt on all previous accounts. According to Dr. Colton's notes, which were not disclosed until 1965 due to patient confidentiality restrictions, Margaret spoke of the man who lived in the walls of the Whitaker home. She described hearing him moving within the house at night for months before the December incident, claiming that both Eleanor and Virginia were aware of his presence but refused to acknowledge it openly. Margaret told Dr. Colton that the man had initially been invited into their home by Eleanor in the summer of 1950, not as a romantic interest, but as some form of business arrangement related to the potential sale of their property. According to Margaret's hospital statements, the man, whom she now identified as possibly named Robert, but he used different names with each of us, had begun living secretly in the house when negotiations became complicated by unspecified outside interests that made his presence in Harlan dangerous. Dr. Colton initially diagnosed Margaret with paranoid delusions, but her interest was piqued when Margaret described architectural details of the house that suggested the presence of concealed spaces or passages. With permission from Eleanor as the property owner, Dr. Colton arranged for an architect to examine the Whitaker home in June 1956. The resulting survey revealed something extraordinary. The house, built in 1878, indeed contained a narrow service corridor between certain walls, a feature not uncommon in homes of that era. More significantly, the architect discovered evidence that someone had been using this space recently. Relatively fresh scratches on the access panel in the pantry, dust patterns suggesting movement, and, most disturbing, a makeshift bedroll and food wrappers concealed in a widened section of the passage. When confronted with this evidence, Eleanor appeared genuinely shocked. Virginia, however, fled the property and disappeared for several days. Upon her return, she claimed to have no knowledge of anyone living in the walls, but suggested that vagrants might have accessed the house when the sisters were away. This explanation was considered implausible, given the hidden and secure nature of the access points to the passage. The investigation reached a stalemate. Without concrete evidence linking any specific individual to the events of December 17, 1950, or to the remains found near the mining road, authorities could not proceed with charges. The case remained officially unsolved, though local speculation ran rampant. The three sisters never lived together again after the 1956 revelation. Eleanor remained in the family home until her death in 1962. Margaret stayed at Eastern State Hospital until 1959, then moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, where she lived quietly until passing away in 1968. Virginia relocated to Knoxville, Tennessee, ironically the home city of Robert Caldwell, where she worked as a librarian until retiring in 1975. She died in 1981, taking whatever she knew of the truth to her grave. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the absence of resolution, but the psychological implications. How could three women who shared the same space, the same experience, develop such fundamentally different understandings of what occurred? Dr. Freeman's sealed notes suggest a phenomenon he called triangulated delusion, where close-knit individuals under stress develop interconnected but contradictory belief systems, each influencing and being influenced by the others until objective reality becomes impossible to establish. In 1967, a graduate student named Alan Pemberton from the University of Kentucky attempted to reconstruct the case as part of his criminology thesis. His research uncovered additional details that had been overlooked or suppressed in the original investigation. Pemberton discovered that Robert Caldwell, the man whose remains were found near the Whitaker property, had indeed been connected to Blue Ridge Mining Company, but not as a land acquisition agent. Payroll records indicated he worked as a union negotiator, often mediating disputes between management and mine workers. This connection became significant when Pemberton found letters in Eleanor Whitaker's personal effects after her death, correspondence between her and representatives from three separate coal companies regarding potential sale of the Whitaker land. These letters, dated between August and November 1950, revealed that Eleanor had been negotiating simultaneously with Cumberland Coal Company, Blue Ridge Mining, and Harlan Consolidated Coal, apparently playing each against the others to secure a better price. One letter from Cumberland Coal, dated November 10, 1950, made reference to your ongoing discussions with our competitor and expressed concern about divided loyalties. This suggested that Eleanor's negotiations had become known to the companies involved, potentially creating tension. Pemberton also discovered that during this precise period, coal labor relations in Harlan County were at a particularly volatile point. The United Mine Workers Union was attempting to organize workers at several mines operated by Cumberland Coal, while Blue Ridge Mining had already established relatively peaceful relations with the union. This placed Caldwell as a union negotiator working for Blue Ridge in a potentially precarious position if he was indeed involved in negotiations for Whitaker land that Cumberland was also pursuing. Perhaps most revealing was Pemberton's interview with Abigail Hayes, the elderly neighbor of the Whitakers who had not been thoroughly questioned during the original investigation. Hayes recalled that in the summer of 1950, she had observed Virginia Whitaker in conversation with a man matching Caldwell's description at the Harlan County Fair. According to Hayes, they appeared familiar with each other, contradicting Virginia's claim of never having met him before their supposed single encounter at the county clerk's office. Hayes also shared a disturbing observation. Approximately 2 weeks before the December incident, she had been delivering preserves to the Whitaker sisters when she overheard an intense argument. Hayes claimed to have heard Eleanor shouting, "He can't stay here anymore. It has to end." When Hayes entered the kitchen, the sisters abruptly ceased their discussion and behaved as if nothing was amiss. Hayes admitted she had not reported this to authorities during the original investigation because it didn't seem important then, and the Whitakers were good neighbors. "I didn't want to make trouble." Pemberton's thesis concluded that the most likely scenario involved Robert Caldwell hiding in the Whitaker home for some period in 1950, possibly due to threats related to his union activities in a county notorious for coal labor violence. He suggested that the December incident might have resulted from rising tensions among the sisters regarding his presence, complicated by potential romantic entanglements, financial considerations regarding the land sale, and the psychological strain of maintaining such a significant secret in a small community. However, Pemberton acknowledged that his reconstruction remained speculative and could not account for all the evidence, particularly the sisters' wildly divergent accounts. His thesis, while well received academically, did little to resolve the case officially. It remains archived at the University of Kentucky Library, occasionally referenced by subsequent researchers, but never leading to formal reopening of the investigation. The Whitaker case might have remained simply an unsolved mystery, a footnote in Harlan County's history, if not for what happened in 1968. The old Whitaker property, which had stood vacant since Eleanor's death, was purchased by a developer planning to convert it into a hunting lodge. During renovations, workers demolishing a section of wall between the dining room and the hidden passage made a grisly discovery: a sealed compartment containing a mummified human hand. Forensic analysis determined the hand belonged to a male and had been separated from the body approximately 20 years prior. More disturbing was the finding that the separation appeared to have been performed with surgical precision, not as the result of trauma or decay. A silver cufflink shaped like a horse's head was found still attached to a fragment of fabric adhering to the preserved wrist, a detail that immediately recalled Margaret's description of the dinner guest from her 1950 statement. No other remains were found on the property, despite an exhaustive search. Ground-penetrating radar was used to examine the soil around the house and well, but no evidence of buried remains was detected. The hand was never conclusively linked to Robert Caldwell or any other individual. DNA testing, which might have resolved the question, was not available in 1968. The specimen was preserved in the county medical examiner's office until a fire destroyed the building and its contents in 1972. By this point, only Margaret and Virginia Whitaker remained alive. Margaret, still residing in Cincinnati, refused all requests for interviews or statements regarding the discovery. Virginia, however, agreed to meet with Detective Samuel Thornton, who had reopened the investigation following the discovery of the hand. The transcript of this interview, conducted in April 1968, reveals a Virginia Whitaker dramatically different from the woman described in the 1950 reports. Now 54 years old and speaking with what Thornton described as unsettling calmness, Virginia offered yet another version of events. In this account, Virginia claimed that a man had indeed been living secretly in their home, but not in December 1950. According to her, a wounded union organizer had sought refuge with them in the summer of 1949, fearing retaliation from anti-union forces during a period of violent labor disputes in the coal fields. Virginia stated that Eleanor, who sympathized with the union cause despite her negotiations with coal companies, agreed to hide the man, whose name Virginia claimed was not Caldwell, but Thomas Barrett. Virginia told Detective Thornton that Barrett lived in the concealed passage for nearly 6 months while recovering from his injuries. During this time, she said, Margaret became romantically involved with him, while Eleanor grew increasingly concerned about the risk of harboring him. According to Virginia, the situation came to a head not on December 17, 1950, but months earlier, when Eleanor discovered Margaret was pregnant with Barrett's child. In Virginia's telling, Eleanor confronted Barrett and demanded he take responsibility for Margaret and the child by marrying her and leaving Harlan County. Barrett allegedly refused, revealing he already had a family in Tennessee. Virginia claimed that Eleanor, enraged by this betrayal, struck Barrett with a fire poker during an argument, killing him unintentionally. Virginia described how she and Eleanor dismembered Barrett's body to conceal the crime, burying the parts at various locations on and around the property. She stated that Margaret suffered a miscarriage shortly thereafter, followed by a mental breakdown that left her with no accurate memory of the events. According to Virginia, the December 1950 incident was merely a fabrication created by Eleanor to redirect any potential investigation, with the sisters intentionally providing contradictory accounts to obscure the truth. When asked why she was revealing this now, nearly 20 years later, Virginia reportedly smiled and said, "Because none of it is true either. The truth is much worse." Detective Thornton's notes indicate that Virginia then refused to elaborate further, maintaining an unsettling smile throughout the remainder of the interview. He described her demeanor as performative, as if reciting lines from a play, rather than recounting actual events. Thornton concluded that Virginia was being deliberately misleading, either out of psychological disturbance or to protect some still hidden truth. The renewed investigation stalled once again. Without physical evidence beyond the severed hand, and with Margaret unable or unwilling to provide coherent testimony, authorities could not determine which, if any, of Virginia's multiple accounts approached the truth. The Whitaker property was ultimately developed into a hunting lodge, which operated from 1969 until 1977, when it was destroyed by a fire of undetermined origin. Local rumor held that guests had reported strange noises in the walls and unexplained cold spots in certain rooms. The property has remained undeveloped since then, gradually reclaimed by the surrounding forest. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case emerged in 1968, following Margaret Whitaker's death in Cincinnati. Among her personal effects was found a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with what appeared to be daily entries spanning from January 1950 to December 1951. The journal, now preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, presents yet another version of events, one that contradicts all previous accounts while containing elements that align with physical evidence. In the journal, Margaret described not one man associated with the Whitaker household, but two: Robert Caldwell, whom she identified as a coal company representative pursuing the purchase of their land, and a second man referred to only as E, who she claimed was Eleanor's secret lover of many years. According to Margaret's writings, Eleanor had been involved with this mysterious E since before their parents' deaths, conducting the relationship in elaborate secrecy due to unspecified complications that prevented them from marrying. Margaret described how Eleanor had the concealed passage modified specifically to allow Whitaker to visit without the knowledge of their parents, and later, without Virginia's awareness. Margaret wrote that Virginia discovered the relationship in late 1950 and became obsessively jealous, not out of romantic interest in E, but from a pathological attachment to Eleanor. The journal detailed Virginia's deteriorating mental state as she began spying on Eleanor and E during their clandestine meetings, sometimes standing for hours in the darkness of the passage, watching through cracks in the wall panels. The journal entry for December 16, 1950, the day before the infamous incident, contains a particularly chilling passage. V took father's old straight razor from the attic today. When I asked what she needed it for, she smiled in that vacant way and said she needed to trim some loose threads. E is coming tomorrow night. I fear what V might do, but E won't listen to my warnings. The December 17th entry is brief and disturbing. It's done. God help us all. The next entry doesn't appear until December 29th and simply states, "We've agreed on what must be said. 3 different stories, 3 impossible truths. No one will believe any of us, and in that confusion lies our only hope of safety. The journal continues with increasingly fragmented entries through 1951, describing Margaret's growing conviction that Virginia was hiding pieces of him throughout the house as some form of disturbed trophy-keeping. One entry mentions finding something wrapped in waxed paper behind a loose brick in the cellar, which Margaret describes being too afraid to unwrap. Another describes hearing Virginia talking to someone in the passage at night, though Margaret believed no one else was in the house. The final entry, dated December 17, 1951, exactly 1 year after the incident, consists of a single line. "I understand now, it wasn't E she wanted to remove. It was never about him at all." Forensic analysis of the journal in 1969 confirmed that the handwriting matched samples of Margaret's from known documents, and that the ink and paper were consistent with the time period. However, psychological experts consulted on the case suggested that the journal might represent not factual accounts, but Margaret's attempts to process trauma through narrative construction, essentially another version of events her mind had created to make sense of something too disturbing to face directly. The identity of E was never established. No records exist of Eleanor Whitaker having been romantically linked to anyone in the community. Property records show that the modifications to create the concealed passage predated the Whitaker sisters' ownership of the house, having been part of the original construction in 1878, contradicting Margaret's claim that Eleanor had the passage specially created. In 1969, Virginia Whitaker was briefly detained and questioned again following the discovery of Margaret's journal. During this interrogation, she was presented with excerpts from the journal. According to the transcript, Virginia listened to the passages without visible reaction, then stated simply, "Margaret always did have a vivid imagination. There was never any E. There was only Robert, and what Eleanor did to him." When pressed to explain this statement, which contradicted her previous accounts, Virginia reportedly became agitated and demanded to know which version the investigators wanted to hear. According to Detective Thornton's notes, she then proceeded to offer yet another narrative, in which Robert Caldwell was a patient from the mental hospital in Lexington who had escaped and been hiding on their property without their knowledge, occasionally stealing food and observing them through the walls. Virginia was released without charges due to insufficient evidence of any specific crime. She returned to Knoxville, where she lived in increasing isolation until her death in 1981. The final chapter in this disturbing saga came in 1978, when an elderly man named Edward Larkin, a retired physician formerly associated with Harlan Memorial Hospital, came forward with information that cast the entire case in a new light. Larkin claimed that in December 1950, Eleanor Whitaker had come to him privately, not at the hospital, but at his home, seeking treatment for what she described as a household accident. According to Larkin, Eleanor had sustained a deep laceration to her upper arm, which he treated and documented in a private record, not in official hospital files. Eleanor allegedly explained that she had fallen against a broken window during a power outage. More significantly, Larkin claimed that 2 days later, Virginia Whitaker also sought his private treatment, presenting with multiple lacerations to her hands and arms, which she attributed to an accident while butchering a hog. Larkin reported that these injuries were consistent with defensive wounds. Perhaps most disturbing was Larkin's claim that approximately 1 week prior to these visits, he had treated a man who identified himself as Edward Thompson, a traveling salesman who had sustained a significant head injury in what he claimed was a fall from a hotel room window. Larkin described Thompson as well-spoken and well-dressed, but evasive about the details of his accident. According to Larkin, the man's injury would have required follow-up treatment, but he never returned to the hospital. When shown a photograph of Robert Caldwell, Larkin identified him as the man he had treated, though he acknowledged the significant time that had elapsed since the encounter. When asked why he had not come forward with this information during the original investigation, Larkin cited professional confidentiality and, more tellingly, fear of repercussions in a community where the Whitaker family, despite their isolation, held considerable influence through their land holdings and historical presence. Larkin's testimony suggested a timeline in which all three Whitaker sisters and a man matching Caldwell's description sustained injuries around the same period in December 1950, contradicting elements of all previous accounts while potentially supporting aspects of each. Moreover, the name Edward Thompson presented a tantalizing possible identity for the mysterious E mentioned in Margaret's journal. Dr. Larkin died in 1982, taking any additional insights he might have had to his grave. With his passing, all the primary figures connected to the Whitaker case were gone, leaving behind only documents, conflicting testimonies, and the enduring mystery of what really happened on that December night in 1950. The Whitaker case remains officially unsolved. The house site, now overgrown and barely recognizable as a former human dwelling, is occasionally visited by local teenagers on dares or by true crime enthusiasts drawn by the legends that have grown around the property. Some claim to hear whispers in the ruins, particularly on December nights when snow falls and the fog settles in the hollows of Harlan County. What really happened to the Whitaker sisters? Did an unknown man intrude upon their isolated home that winter night, or was the danger always within their walls? Did Robert Caldwell die at their hands, or was his presence near their property mere coincidence? Was there ever an E, or was he a figment of Margaret's disturbed imagination? Did Virginia create multiple contradicting accounts to obscure the truth, or had she genuinely lost the ability to distinguish between reality and her own fabrications? Perhaps most unsettling is the possibility that emerged from Dr. Freeman's psychological evaluations, that each sister genuinely believed her version of events to be true, their minds having constructed separate realities in response to some shared trauma too terrible to process directly. In this interpretation, the truth of that night in December 1950 was not merely hidden or obscured, but fractured and distributed among three different psyches, none of which contained a complete or accurate picture. In 1985, Dr. Carolyn Mitchell, a forensic psychologist specializing in family trauma, published an extensive analysis of the Whitaker case in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. Drawing on all available documentation and interviews with peripheral figures still living, Mitchell proposed what she termed a mosaic theory of the events. Mitchell suggested that elements of all the contradictory accounts might contain fragments of truth, assembled incorrectly and contaminated by each sister's psychological needs and defenses. She proposed that Robert Caldwell had indeed been present at the Whitaker home, possibly involved in both business negotiations regarding the land and a clandestine relationship with one or more of the sisters. The hidden passage may have facilitated this arrangement, allowing him to remain on the property undetected by outside observers during a period of heightened tensions in the coal industry. According to Mitchell's reconstruction, the December 17th incident likely involved a violent confrontation among Caldwell and the sisters, possibly triggered by jealousy, betrayal, or fear of discovery. She theorized that all three sisters may have participated in the violence to varying degrees, with their subsequent contradictory accounts representing not deliberate deception, but psychological compartmentalization. Each sister remembering and accepting only the portions of events that her mind could tolerate. The discovery of the severed hand in 1968 with its silver cufflink matching Margaret's description lends credence to the theory that Caldwell died in the house rather than fleeing wounded, as Eleanor claimed. The remains found near the mining road in 1953, presumed to be Caldwell's, might represent an elaborate misdirection created by the sisters to divert attention from the actual disposal of the body, perhaps dismembered and concealed in multiple locations as Virginia once claimed, only to retract the statement later. Dr. Mitchell's analysis, while compelling in its integration of the contradictory evidence, remains speculative. Without forensic evidence that has long since been destroyed or witnesses who have all passed away, the truth of what happened at the Whitaker house may never be fully known. The weathered headstones of Eleanor, Margaret, and Virginia Whitaker now stand in the small cemetery behind Cumberland Baptist Church, arranged in a triangle, each facing away from the others in death as they had in their final years of life. Local folklore holds that on certain nights, particularly during December snowfalls, visitors to the cemetery have reported seeing 3 female figures standing among the graves, each pointing in a different direction, as if still unable to agree on which way leads to the truth. The Whitaker case represents more than an unsolved mystery. It stands as a testament to the fragility of human perception and memory, and to the disturbing capacity of the mind to construct and maintain alternate versions of reality when the truth becomes too terrible to bear. In Harlan County, they still say that when the fog rolls down from Ivy Mountain and settles around the old Whitaker property, you can hear 3 voices whispering 3 different stories, none of them true, and none of them entirely false. For some mysteries, perhaps resolution lies not in determining which account is correct, but in understanding why multiple accounts became necessary in the first place. In the silence of the Appalachian hollows, the conflicting testimonies of the Whitaker sisters continue to echo, a reminder that sometimes the most haunting horrors are not those we can see or name, but those that fragment our very perception of reality. The case files remain accessible through the Kentucky State Archives, cataloged under reference number HC 1953-117, for those who wish to examine the evidence and draw their own conclusions. But those who have studied the case most deeply often come away with more questions than answers, and with the unsettling sense that some truths are not merely hidden but shattered beyond reconstruction, existing only as fragments dispersed across multiple minds, multiple narratives, and perhaps multiple dimensions of reality itself.